legacy at Wesley. The faculty and the administration uh, strongly invested in uh, holding an annual lecture that would carry forward the legacy of Dr. King, his scholarship, and the ways in which that scholarship has shaped the world. One of those was none other than Coretta Scott King. We've had King scholars. We've had a great deal of other uh, preacher practitioners, leaders, pastors, and a wonderful host of activists. And so it's my pleasure to always welcome new scholars to the Wesley community to be a part of the discussions and the legacies here. We are excited to have with us a preeminent scholar, one who is a close and dear friend. I just got off the phone with her. We've got a little bit of a technical snafu that she's working out, so she's going to be joining us in about 4 minutes. She's coming from the West Coast, and one of the important things we always need to do when we are Zooming now is remember time zone differences. So part of that was some of the challenges that were there, but she'll be joining us in just a few minutes. Let me say a word about her wonderful text while we wait. In part, her lecture will be from this text, and that is a wonderful book entitled Bearing Witness While Black, African Americans, Smartphones, and the New Protest #journalism. This is a wonderful text. There's been a group of staff here at Wesley that have read this text and been studying together this text and its meaning. Let me say this text was published and released on the same week that George Floyd was murdered. And so this is a timely text. Dr. Richardson has been a part of many different conversations related to the phenomenon of camera phones and protest journalism. So this has been a very prescient and appropriate text for us. And so I'm excited to have her. I believe she's setting up now, so we're excited to welcome her shortly. I'll wait till she turns her camera on. That's how I'll know she's ready. And I'll do my introduction. Again, as you're coming in, good to see all of you coming into the session. Glad to have you in the chat area, and we'll be starting momentarily. Just as another reminder, we'll have our lecture, and then following the lecture will be an opportunity we have people monitoring the chats and other places to highlight questions that you might have of our guest lecturer here on today. Hello there. There you are.
Good afternoon.
Hello there. How are you?
How are you, Dr. Lee?
I'm fine, Dr. Richardson. I'm glad we got it solved in the nick of time. So thank you. Thank you. You know, before pandemics, we didn't think about time zones nearly as much as we ought to now. So we're thankful.
Absolutely.
So we've got a community gathered here, and what we're going to do is I've said a little bit about our King lecture. I've also highlighted our text. Or the text that you've written and the wonderful text you have. So I'm going to do a formal introduction and then turn it over to you. Actually, what I'll do is a formal introduction, a short prayer, and then turn it over to you to give us our 2020 Martin Luther King lecture. So good afternoon, everyone again. Good evening or morning or wherever you are. I am the Reverend Dr. Asa Lee, and I serve as the Vice President for Campus Administration and Associate Dean for Community Life and Director of African American Church Studies at Wesley Theological Seminary in Washington, D.C. We are excited to have you all join us in our annual Martin Luther King lecture. This is the seminary's annual opportunity to explore the meaning and the legacy of the work of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King and the ways in which the edge of social justice and social prophetic witness are taking place in the world. We are excited to have a home girl, a friend of mine, a dear colleague. I'm going to tell a little bit of our business for a second, Dr. Richardson. Many of you know I'm from the suburbs of Washington, D.C., to Prince George's County to be precise. And when I was a sophomore, or rather a junior, there came a freshman trumpet player in high school who sat 2 chairs over from me and needed some shepherding along the way to be a excellent musician, and went on to do extraordinary things. And that was none other than Dr. Richardson herself. And so we've known each other for a very long time. And I'm excited to see what she's been able to produce and in the world. So let me give a little bit of her background and research. Dr. Allissa Richardson is an assistant professor of journalism at the University of Southern California's Annenberg School of Communication and Journalism. She researches how African Americans use mobile and social media to produce innovative forms of journalism, especially in times of crisis. Dr. Richardson's research is informed by her book, and as an instructor and journalist, she's considered a pioneer in what's called Mojo, or mobile journalism. She launched the first smartphone-only college newsroom in 2010 on the campus of Morgan State University in Baltimore. Dr. Richardson serves on the editorial boards of Digital Journalism and the International Journal of Communication, and she is also an affiliated researcher with New York University's Center for Critical Race and Digital Studies. She holds the PhD in Journalism Studies from the University of Maryland, College Park, the Knight School of Journalism, and has a master's degree in magazine publishing from Northwestern University's Medill School, and a Bachelor of Science in Biology from Xavier University in Louisiana, where she was named the top 40 under 40 alumna. She has numerous awards and fellowships, and she is a stellar scholar, the 2020 author of Bearing Witness While Black. I'm excited to welcome to our virtual lecture platform, Dr. Allissa V. Richardson as our 2021 Martin Luther King lecturer. Dr. Richardson.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Dean Lee. I really appreciate it. And I appreciate the friendship over the years and your shepherding, mentoring, and as I was deciding to come into academia, just all of the advice that you've given over the years. So thank you for that. I'd also like to thank President McAllister Wilson, as well as your Dean, Wengai Arayo, and your faculty for inviting me to really share my research at such a prestigious platform. Doing this lecture and being a part of this series is really a pinnacle for me as a junior scholar to really share with you the impact of witnessing, and not only in witnessing in a journalistic sense, but witnessing in terms of a Christian woman. I don't get to do that very often. And so I'm very excited to be able to speak freely about how my faith and work have intermingled over the years and how I'm seeing a lot of Christianity being woven into the work of citizen journalists today. So I'm really excited because it's my pleasure to really speak at the same college where Wesleyan principles are taught. It was AME preachers who launched the first Black newspaper back in 1827. And it's on their shoulders that I stand as I deliver this lecture of faith, bearing witness, and God's call on my life to always fight for justice through journalism. And so I'm going to share some slides with you all so that we can have some visuals to go along with this lecture. Make sure I share some sound too. All right, hopefully everyone can see that. Okay.
Yes.
Now, I refer in my work a lot as journalism having a moral imperative. And so for the next few minutes, I really want to walk you through how I came to this decision to really treat journalism as not only a tool of activism, but an act of our faith, an act of speaking out and professing against things that are wrong. And I would say one of the biggest God winks that I received was when I was a doctoral student in 2014. I thought that I would go in studying the impact of mobile journalism, or MOJO, on African American girls, but God had a way of really showing me that He wanted me to do something even bigger and broader. And I met this gentleman, Devin Allen, who's featured here in our opening title card, when he was a protester. He was really taking pictures with a cell phone and a fancy DSLR, alternating between the two, on the streets of Baltimore in 2015. At that time, I was teaching at Bowie State University. And when I was just glued to my Instagram, seeing all of the images that he was coming up with, I was just so impressed by his eye and his courage. And in getting a chance to meet him, I wrote him and immediately asked if my students could come on up and talk to him for a bit. He eagerly said yes and allowed us to meet him, ironically, not so ironically, in a store called City of God. And that was one of his favorite shops. It's a place where he felt safe. And it was a clothing store. And as I walked in and looked at that above the threshold there, I kind of got a chill. I thought, wow, I think that I'm just coming in to talk to someone about photography, but maybe this is bigger than what I'm initially thinking it is. And as it turns out, it was. And so Devin shared with me that day some notes on journalism that have stuck with me for the last 6 years or so. They never leave me. And I want you to hear it from his own voice, his own words.
So I just felt I could tell the story and done of the uprising better than any media outlet, and I feel like I did. And I wanted to show. I know that media is only going to show one side of everything, and I knew I can tell both sides of the fence. Show you the negative, but also show you the positive things that came from due to the death of Freddie Gray.
Now, immediately when he said those words, my students and I looked at each other. We were thinking, wow, here I am trying to train them to be journalists. And he's saying, I can do this job better than you. And it turns out that he was right. He said, Black people need witnesses in this world. And he was quoting James Baldwin. Black people need witnesses in this hostile world, were his exact words to the New York Times. And when Devin Allen took his pictures that day, they landed on the cover of Time magazine, making him only one of 3 amateurs, if we can even call him that anymore, who had made that feat possible. He did it again this past summer, when he took pictures of the peaceful die-ins in Baltimore City, and they also landed on the cover of Time magazine. And this experience of meeting him, talking to him, and meeting many, many more people like him began to put together in my mind a decade's worth of work in a shape and a form that I'm going to share with you today. And it's all about witnessing to me. It's all about bearing witness for Black people, because when James Baldwin said that, I didn't really know why he chose that particular thing as the remedy for the Black community. I thought, well, Black people need many, many things. There's so many structural things in our way. Why witnesses? And so as a grad student, I just kind of went down this rabbit hole and I started to study how many times does the word witness appear in the Bible? And in the New King James Version, using the Bible study tools that I had at my disposal at the time, I found 175 different instances of the word witness in Bible. I also found that, and I realized very early on as a child, I'd already learned one of the key 10 commandments is you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. And I thought this is a really important concept to God, that someone somewhere make sure that there is a record of something that is correct and accurate and true. But when I began to think throughout history of all the false witnesses that have come against the African American community, I really thought, how can journalism do a better job today of making sure that these things don't happen? And Carolyn Bryant really stood out to me. This is a picture of her in 1955 when she testified that Emmett Till had groped her and whistled at her. Later on, she admitted to a New York Times journalist that that wasn't true, but that later was more than 60 years after his historic and iconic lynching. Mamie Till Mobley chose Jet Magazine, a journalistic outfit, to show the world what they did to her baby that day. Now, in my presentations, I don't show these pictures because many of us are very familiar with them. I also don't show these pictures because part of bearing witness is not only holding up the martyr, but holding up the person that made their death so. And so in this lecture, you'll see me oscillate between not always fixating on the victim, but putting our lens and casting our witness on the injustice itself, on the person practicing the injustice. Because to me, that's the way we truly tell the full story of what happened. Now, with Miss Bryant, she was able to share this with a journalist many, many years after many of the other persons who perpetrated the crime had passed away. And she herself died very quietly in Mississippi with little fanfare. But I kept thinking, how can I infuse this into my work? 10 years ago, I started the first Mojo Lab, and it was pretty much on a whim. That was the first year that I realized that this iPhone had a front and rear facing camera, and my students could see themselves. So that was not only the year that the selfie was born, but we were doing our own stand-ups, really having fun in the lab, and using these tools in ways that no one had before. We were figuring things out together, so much so that nobody really knew what we were doing. And so we made a commercial, this explainer, to share what is a mojo.
Mojo is a mobile journalist. It's a student who reports using only mobile devices. The equipment has gotten a lot smaller for reporting. You see how our head is like still at the top and sometimes out of the frame? Very nice. You can report from a cell phone these days and then send it right back to the newsroom using a Wi-Fi connection or any local type of internet connection. And that's really what we want to instill in our students, is that when you see news right on the spot, you do have the ability to capture it and send it back someplace and get paid for it. A lot of them are kind of getting out of the mindset of, I have to work for the next big media outlet. And a lot of them are getting more comfortable with the introduction of this Mojo project with working for themselves. Journalism is serious. It's hard. It's not something that you're just going to succeed at very quickly. Okay. Good, it was steady. She's right in the middle. The way that you sound has to kind of translate to different places. Let's do that again. Don't try to hide it. That's really what the Mojo project is giving them these new mobile skills and also teaching them how to be entrepreneurial in the process of gathering or reporting news.
And that's one of my favorite videos because all of the students have gone on to fantastic careers in journalism, whether they're working at CNN in Ghana or working at the New York Times. They're creating fascinating things. But we started out quite innocently, right? Trying to talk about how to use these devices to lower the barrier of entry. I was at a school that had very limited resources, and we were trying to figure out how in the world will we launch a journalism school on a shoestring? And these mobile devices really opened up that portal to them. The exciting thing about the work we were doing is that I was getting invitations left and right to do Mojo, as we were calling it. And every conference that I went to, I tried to take at least 2 or 3 students with me. And there was one conference in DC that we attended for the International Media Women's Foundation. And at that conference, someone approached me from Global Girl Media and said, can you create a Mojo curriculum for us in Africa? And I said, of course, may I bring students? And so there we were, we set out and we went to South Africa first in the wake of the World Cup when things were kind of dying down and they wanted to keep the excitement around the country alive. We went there and created this Mojo program and taught HIV positive girls how to tell their stories. And through that, each of them got a chance to share what they otherwise wouldn't have been able to say aloud. They all wanted to self-identify and talk about it freely. And they were invited on World AIDS Day to come to New York and share their videos that they created. They were excited when they rode on the subway to hear people speaking Zulu, which they did not expect to hear. And they were even more excited to see their pictures in Times Square as invited guests of the film festivals we were attending. It's also one of the saddest moments, though, I think, when I start to think about where some of the girls are now. One of my very, very favorite students, who's pictured here, Lorato, with her braids, who stooped down, passed away from her disease a couple of years after the program ended. And I dedicated the book to Lorato because I thought maybe Lorato wouldn't have had a chance to do journalism had it not been for this tiny device that fits in your pocket. Because again, we were on a very small budget trying to figure out how can we get a camera into the hands of every single young person that we want to teach. I'm excited though, because many of the girls did thrive afterwards, even though we all miss Lorato and we all really appreciated the thousands of words that she filed, the dozens of stories that she filed, many in the backseat of this blue van that you see. She would chop them up on her phone and push them right onto YouTube as quickly as she could. I also think about a lot of the other youth that I couldn't bring back with me. And I write to them often because we talk a lot about how can we keep journalism going? What can we do? This is another one of my favorite students, Stakozo. And here we are in Cliptown, in Nelson Mandela's hometown, interviewing boys about what it'll be like to live in a world without their beloved Madiba. That was just right before his health started going really, really downhill. And students were afraid. They were like, what are we going to do without him? And so we did a series of stories that commemorated him and gave him his flowers while he was still alive. After that program was so successful, we got invited to Morocco because you must remember during that same time was when the Arab Spring uprisings were popping up across the continent. And so there I am in our hotel room looking at the news to see people using cell phones in Egypt and Tunisia and Libya to report on unrest there. The king of Morocco didn't want that unrest in his country. And he said, what kind of program can we bring to bring news to the people so that they feel like they can use these tools in ways that don't have to be antagonistic? And so we created our Mojo program, the Morocco edition. And it was a really interesting experience because in Morocco, women are not allowed to be out in public without male accompaniment. And so there I am, about 5 feet tall. You all can't tell, but Dean Lee knows my band nickname was Little Bits. I'm very tiny. And so there I am with all of these girls behind me, about 40 behind me with these devices. And we get a call from a window just above us. It said, hey, hey. And I look up and then the person disappears from the window. And all of a sudden the door just flings open. And this gentleman says, are you the girls on the street? And I said, I don't know, are we? And he said, you all are trending on Twitter. And that's when I realized, wow, this is this will be a global phenomenon. And he said, what are you doing with these cell phones? And I told him, we are doing news. And I asked if we could take a picture of the little people who were peeking out from behind him. And behind him were 6 gorgeous little girls who all wanted to participate. Now, he didn't allow them to be photographed, and so I never show them. He doesn't like people to circulate them and share them. But he said, you can take a picture of me. And that's what he posed here and did for us. And every day for the rest of that month that we were in Morocco, he brought all 6 of his girls to be Mojos. And I remember he said, I believe in this technology. It's really magic. One of the things that was so interesting to see also is that everywhere we went in the souk, or what is called the open air market there, you would see people just staring like, what are these girls doing out? And how are they doing news with just that? And one of my more memorable moments there, you had the network news carrying a big bulky camera on their shoulders, really chasing after the girls trying to get shots for the evening program. And they said, do you want to trade? That looks so light and easy and you can edit from it. You don't have to go back to a satellite truck. That's amazing. And one of the things that I discovered most about that whole experience being on the continent for nearly 3 months was that I wanted to teach more. I'd kind of fallen into teaching after a long career in magazine and newspapers. And I realized I wanted to spend more time thinking and reflecting on what I'd done. And so I was accepted into the Nieman Fellowship for Journalism at Harvard. And I spent time there really taking in everything I'd seen on the continent, the good and the bad parts of Mojo, and where did I think it was going to go. After that, I realized you can really make a career out of thinking and reading and writing and talking. No one told me this. And so I went back to school and earned my PhD so that I'd be able to do exactly what I'm doing right now with you all. But something else happened. Here comes some more God winks. I'm studying And I'm looking through the literature, I'm doing my lit reviews, and I'm not seeing anything about the Black experience as it pertains to witnessing. I'd already known that false witnessing got my people into so much trouble, it could be deadly in many cases when people lied on us. But I didn't see any instance of that anywhere in the literature. I saw a lot of papers, and rightfully so, about the Arab Spring protests. Here you see an Academy Award-winning film which features citizen journalists who recorded the uprisings in Tahrir Square. And in even more papers, I began to see coverage of Occupy Wall Street and the use of telephones there. This protester, Tim Pool, that you see, became the first person to attach a drone to a cell phone and get the only aerial footage of the protests that exist because they couldn't get news helicopters in between the skyscrapers. And so I saw tons of papers on Tim. As you can see behind him, the city is so densely populated, the building's so tall, that he became the person that everyone listened to during that time. He was a case study and a phenomenon. But again, I just kept thinking, what about this? I kept thinking of my time as a youngster and seeing my dad really frozen and lost for words. And I was tucked under his arm on the couch, 9 years old, watching this video. And my dad is a son of the Caribbean. And so he said, Jesus, back home, they don't do this to people. My dad never uses the Lord's name in vain, so I knew something was seriously wrong. I just kept searching his face for answers. And I was scared because he said, back home. I was thinking, what do you mean? Home is here for me. So is this something that can happen to me, to my brother, to you? Now, it would be many years before Ta-Nehisi Coates would write his book, Between the World and Me, which really shone a light on the Prince George's County Police Department for all its brutality. But I was sheltered from much of that in my youth. All I knew was my friends, band, pom-poms, and fun. But seeing this video broke down something. It broke down that wall to let me know that there was a world out there and that all cops weren't good. Even though I was a child of the 80s and grew up in the Dare, Just Say No to Drugs era, and we had a beautiful cop named Officer Blue come into our school and lecture us and bring us pizzas, and we got a great button that said Dare, something was off. And I kept saying, why is no one researching how watershed this video is to really showing that there was someone bearing false witness all these years about what was truly happening to Black people and their relationship with police. And then in the first week of the grad school program, when we're really getting started, there's orientation, professors are talking to us, it's the excitement and the buzz of the new school year. This is when Ferguson erupted. And I didn't learn about Ferguson from CNN or any of the other major networks. I learned about it on Twitter. A man named Emmanuel Freeman actually tweeted about it. Oh, they just shot someone in front of my apartment. And there was a picture of Mike Brown lying in a pool of his own blood. And what we now know, Officer Wilson walking back and forth in front of his body. And to my chagrin, I found out that he lay there for 4 hours uncovered. A lot of that gets lost in the mythology of Ferguson, that this whole protest began as a protest of moms, of mothers, who banded together and said, at the very least, cover him up. And then as the dads come off work and the crowd grows, the militarized response then grows. And the Ferguson that we then see mediated with flashbangs and fire and brimstone is what we all remember about that moment. And I was really upset to see that there were almost 2 different narratives going on. On Twitter, I'm seeing a bunch of narratives about children being tear gassed and the peaceful protests that are being agitated by police. But then I'm seeing on CNN and other channels that this is being agitated, in fact, by people who live there. And then there are conflicting reports about outsiders who are also causing trouble, who don't even live in Ferguson. And this is when I began to realize that this would be my life's work, deciphering how many other times have journalists, maybe inadvertently or on purpose, created these counter narratives that were false. How many times have journalists bore false witness? And so the tipping points just became so large that I realized I couldn't ignore this phenomenon anymore in my own personal work. It went from me wanting to train young people to use these cell phones in fun ways, but also introduce them to news, to really preserving Black stories that are captured in duress. And so what I realized was police killings are happening to African Americans at a rate that are disproportionate. African Americans are 3 times more likely to be killed by police than white people. That was my first tipping point. My next piece of data that I collected is that fewer than 1 in 3 Black people killed by police in 2016 were even suspected of a violent crime. So that dispelled the myth that they must have been doing something very violent that escalated it to this degree. Most people were performing what we call performing crimes of poverty, floating a $20 bill during a pandemic because they were trying to get something to eat, selling loose cigarettes, selling CDs or DVDs. Also, I'm seeing at this time Black protests really taking off. The Black Lives Matter movement kicked up in earnest. More than 30 chapters sprang up around the globe. And at the same time, the Black press is dying. I'm seeing the magazine that I used to work for, Jet and Ebony, really struggle to stay alive. But I'm hopeful because I'm seeing smartphone ownership spiking up, and I'm seeing Twitter usage spike up too. So much so that even though African Americans are only 13% of the population, 28% of them are on Twitter at any given time. So, what did all this mean? I began to clump all of these testimonies into what I call these 3 overlapping eras of Black witnessing. And I realized that Black people have been doing this all along. We haven't just been doing this with the advent of cell phones, but we've been trying to shine a light on injustice as long as we've been here. We've tried to bear witness to slavery through slave narratives and newspapers later. We've tried to bear witness to lynching through newspapers as well. We've tried to bear witness to police brutality through television and now cell phones. And who knows what will be next? But as police brutality is the end result of this virus almost that has mutated over the years, so too has African Americans' need to mutate the way that they tell stories. And so I thought about these participants, this new vanguard of folks who are telling these stories, who are doing the work of Frederick Douglass, who wrote not 1, not 2, but 3 slave narratives, and also became a newspaper man in his day. I think about the work of Ida B. Wells and how she was posthumously awarded a Pulitzer Prize last year for tallying lynching during her day in newspapers. I think about the legendary John Lewis and how he manipulated his 15 minutes of fame, if you call it, because the news only lasted 15 minutes in the 60s, and how he had to know to stage that sit-in or that protest right when the journalists were coming. And I think about all of those ancestors and how they poured into these 15 people the skills that they would need to create what we now know as the Black Lives Matter movement. And so I went through and I just started going on this search to find as many witnesses as I could, because I realized all these videos that were bubbling up of police brutality, of Oscar Grant, of Walter Scott, of Freddie Gray, all of these were being filmed by Black people who were saying that this moment in history is different. In the past, during slavery, African Americans could not look. If you've ever seen the film 12 Years a Slave, you know that there's a scene where Chiwetel Ejiofor is hanging, and there are Black people in the background sweeping because they can't look, lest they incur the wrath of the master themselves. If you've ever seen a lynching photograph, you know that they're not Black people huddled in the margins, waiting and peeking and seeing what is going on. They were likely fleeing town or trying to stay at home to make sure that their loved one came home. And for many of them, they didn't. But this time, in this era of domestic terror against Black people, we can look in real time, for better or worse, and we can say with our cameras, I'm not going to leave you in this moment. I'm going to make sure people know your name. I'm going to make sure people know the aggressor, and I'm going to push for change because you can. And so that Black witnessing became to me the guiding principle with which I studied all of the acts that these activists were doing. Black witnessing is distinct, and it has 3 characteristics. The first is that it adopts this surveillance look. So whereas surveillance occurs from over top and you're looking from above from a blue camera light or a police helicopter or a police dash cam, looking from below is surveillance. And that is what they are doing. They have an editorial stance also that stitches together history. So for example, you will not find many instances of people not beginning with Emmett Till and linking him to Trayvon Martin. For many African Americans, that link is just inexplicable, and it is a historic thread that goes throughout their work. They realize that they're doing this for ancestors. And the third quality is they will hack any technological system that they need to use it to meet their ends to distribute the news. So it's surveillance, it stitches together history in historic ways, it stitches together history in meaningful ways, and it also uses technology in ways that help them get the word out. And so I interviewed the foundress, as I called her, of Black Lives Matter, Allissa Garza. Also, some of the day ones, as they call themselves, the people who were on the front lines of Ferguson, Brittany Packnett and Brittany Farrell. I interviewed rappers like David Banner, who told me why he stepped down from making his particular brand of hip hop and embraced instead a more intellectual brand of hip hop and became an elder statesman during the Ferguson uprisings. I also talked to the family attorney of Walter Scott and Alton Sterling and now George Floyd. His name is Chris Stewart, and he really said to me on many occasions, I'm just doing the Lord's work. I went to Thurgood Marshall's law school, and I'm just doing the Lord's work. And to hear him say that over and over again, and to hear that echo throughout the theme of so many of these other activists and their work was inspiring to me. And so I want you to hear from some of them. Brittany Packnett really believed in the power of revision. She said, we need to revise a lot of these narratives that we're telling about African Americans, and it has to start with you, journalists. So you may know Brittany from this scene here. Our former President Obama handpicked her to help lead the 21st Century Commission on Policing. And this is what she had to say about why she started to do her own brand of mobile journalism, why she became a mojo.
On the ground, people would go up to cameras and say, until people are tweeting me right now, calling me right now, saying that you're reporting this incorrectly, so we're going to stand here in front of your camera until you decide to tell the truth. So there was not only a decision to give the truth ourselves, there was also a clear decision to challenge mainstream media and hold them accountable to speaking the truth as well. And social media gave us the access to do that.
And Brittany wasn't the only one to say that she felt this was a watershed moment for her and that she couldn't just stay away and she couldn't entrust it to journalists. I also heard the same thing from Clint Smith, who said, it is my responsibility to do this work. Clint and I started grad school the same week that Mike Brown was killed. And he went on to earn his EDD from Harvard and now writes for The Atlantic magazine. And so he, like Brittany, jumped into journalism, became a mojo. And you may remember him from this. You may have seen his TED Talk. It has over 6 million views, and it's How to Raise a Black Boy in America. And he's a poet, and he's from New Orleans originally. And this is what he had to say about why he took to Twitter to report almost nonstop during the Ferguson uprisings.
I started graduate school the same week Mike Brown was killed, and so it was impossible for me to disentangle what I saw happening in the world and what I was reading about in my book. So I started to use Twitter as a way to share sort of snippets of what I was learning.
Clint, like Brittany, has now entered the ranks of journalism in earnest. Brittany is an MSNBC contributor that you may see on television daily. And Clint Smith writes for the same magazine that W.E.B. Du Bois and Frederick Douglass wrote for, The Atlantic. I also want to share with you words of Aisha Evans. She said that journalism has the job of redressing the grievances that African Americans have, and for so long it hasn't done that. I found out about Aisha from this picture that many of you all may recognize. I was in Italy at the time, in Milan, lecturing, And as I came off the airport and was kind of piddling around in the newsstands, because I love to see magazines from other countries, I come across a magazine that has this on the cover. And unfortunately, my very first thought, you all, was this looks like home. I was thinking, this doesn't look like over here. This looks like home. And I asked the gentleman who was running the newsstand, can you please translate this headline for me? And he said, oh, he heard my accent and he said, are you American? I said, yes. He said, yeah, this happened while you were on your overnight flight. They killed a man in Baton Rouge. And then the very next day, the police killed someone, Philando Castile, and they put it on camera. I would later find out that these men were Alton Sterling, of course, and Philando Castile, and that both incidents, again, were filmed by African Americans in a state of duress trying to bear witness. Now, Aisha said when she went down, she didn't need to know anybody. She wasn't part of a chapter. She said, I just felt compelled to go, to bear witness, to see what was going on. Now, when she was met with police, and this is what she said happened to her. She disappeared and kind of went off the grid for 3 days. No one knew where she was.
I didn't even know what I was being charged with until my bond was posted, until I had an amount for me to bail out of jail with. Until then, I didn't know what I was being, detained for. In prison, not jail, not no central bookings, like prison. It's real in Louisiana.
And so she said they later charged her with obstructing a highway and said where she was located in Louisiana, a 3-lane road could be designated as a highway if the police needed to consider it as such. And for this instance, they did. The last person I want to introduce you to out of the 15 is Marissa Johnson, who said that she was doing the work, she was finishing the work of Fannie Lou Hamer. Many of you who may know that name know that in the 1960s, she attempted to testify at the Democratic National Convention about police brutality. She said, I was just helping people vote. I was trying to help them register to vote. And she started to talk about the beatings that she endured from police when trying to do so. And President Lyndon Baines Johnson preempted her talk. He preempted her speech with a phony kind of announcement to the nation, and she never got to finish. Where Marissa Johnson said, this time I wanted to be the Johnson doing the interrupting. And so you may remember her from this scene here, where she is interrupting the presidential hopeful Bernie Sanders on his dais. Now this was in her hometown of Seattle, and she just asked for a moment of silence, 4 minutes for the 4 hours that Mike Brown had lie in the road in his hometown, and the organizers wouldn't have it. They wouldn't allow the women to do the moment of silence. So they jumped up and took the mic anyway. And this is what Marissa said about her experience.
I felt like it was a lot like a sit-in in terms of just like at least secondhand images that I've gotten through media and things like that of like just the utter and vile hatred that white folks have for you. Like if I was going to describe like what, like it felt very emotional and it felt very spiritual to me in terms of like having like literally over 1,000 angry white mob like screaming at you, and you can tell in their voices like they hate you, like they really hate you so much, and you're so inconveniencing them, and that their first thought when they're inconvenienced is violence. Like, do you know what I mean? And I feel like sins are because they're trying to maintain their power. And I felt like, you know, it was so similar to sit-in in terms of, you know, what is somebody sitting at your counter but an inconvenience in the grand scheme of things? If you really don't like Black people or you don't want them there, but that it pokes that white supremacy in such a way that there's a violent and vicious and obviously irrational response.
Marissa told me as she was leaving, she had a band of white allies around her, forming a human circle just so she'd be safe enough to leave the dais, and that those allies were bitten on their arms and backs. All of this then went into my eventual dissertation, which became a book last year, Bearing Witness While Black, African Americans, Smartphones, and the New Protest Journalism. And I really poured in the last 10 years of everything that I have observed, from my work as a professor at Morgan State University, starting the Morgan Mojo Lab, really experimenting and playfully tinkering with the limits of journalism and what we could produce, to the more grave observations that I made on the continent of Africa, where I saw unrest in the northern parts of the region during the Arab Spring, or even the ability that it had to give young girls a voice who might never have a chance to enter journalism otherwise, to then these current moments that we're witnessing of Black people who are picking up that mantle of using journalism as a key tool for activism. And this summer, as many of you know, this book became not just a retrospective on the Black Lives Matter movement, but it came out 2 weeks before George Floyd was killed. And my whole way that I was going to approach talking about this movement changed. I thought I would be talking about it as a historic flashpoint, but again, as you all know, this is something that endured. It wasn't a moment, it was truly a movement. And I picked up this cover of the New Yorker because it spoke to me so much. And the great Kadir Nelson, who painted it, did in one portrait, in one painting, what I tried to do in 300 pages. And he's showing you here the overlapping eras of domestic terror and all of the damage, all of the death that bearing false witness against Black people has wrought. So you can see at the very bottom, the middle passage and the diagram of how African Americans would have been lined up in the bellies of slave ships. You can see Whipped Pete at the bottom, who's the very first slave who volunteered to have his picture taken by journalists so people would know what slavery looked like. You also see in here Reverend Dr. King, for whom this lecture series is named. You also see Medgar Evers and Malcolm X. You see I Am a Man, the very last stand, the very last protest that Dr. King participated in for the Memphis sanitation workers. In the very center of this, you see what I saw at age 9, the Rodney King video. And on, we see Emmett Till here, who was lied on by Carolyn Bryant. We see a man was lynched yesterday, the iconic flag that flew outside of NAACP's headquarters for more than 20 years. And Sandra Bland is here, and Alton Sterling is here, and Freddie Gray is here, Tamir Rice is here, Trayvon Martin is here. And the sad thing about this photograph, but sad thing about this painting, is that there's so many others that could be here, but just couldn't fit. And as I began to see my research really pick up and people say, yes, these are videos that are telling us about things we didn't know about. Our eyes were closed before, we were distracted before, but now with this pandemic, we see. I began to see a different undercurrent, a different thing happen that took my research in yet a different direction. I began to see people sharing these videos with little context, no trigger warnings, and with reckless abandon on their social media platforms. That was one thing, but seeing this also happen by professionals in my field, journalists who'd been trained in ethics, just looping George Floyd dying over and over again with the casual air of a sports highlight just disturbed me so, to the point where I couldn't even shield my children in many cases, couldn't turn off the TV fast enough before they saw glimpses of it. And I thought, how traumatizing must this be to his family? No one should have to be entombed online in this way. And I began to think, I can't think of a time where I've ever seen a white person entombed in line on that way, or I couldn't think of the last time I saw a white person die on network television. And I made the point in this essay that perhaps we've gotten so used to violence against Black bodies in the form of Whipped Pete the slave, in the form of Black people who were tossed about with fire hoses during the civil rights movement, in the form of women being carried away on stretchers on Bloody Sunday. Have we become so comfortable with Black discomfort, Black pain, that we're okay with sharing these videos now? We shouldn't be. And I argued that we should elevate them to the level of lynching photographs. And in the same way that we would not just share a lynching photograph just carelessly on our social media profiles, many of us, we should be more thoughtful, especially in the news, about how we share them. I argued further that when white people die, we make sure to scrub that from the internet when they die violently. And I pointed out that there used to be videos of people jumping to their death out of those buildings on 9/11. And thankfully, because it was a horrific moment for all of us, that footage disappeared from the web. We scrubbed it, and rightfully so. We did the same thing when a journalist, Daniel Pearl, lost his life on camera, when terrorists beheaded him on camera. And that circulated on the web for a short time and it was scrubbed. And thankfully, rightfully so. I thought of it over and over again in the instances of the mass shootings that occurred at the film festivals out this way in Las Vegas, and how those videos disappear so quickly. And we as journalists get to work so fast to humanize each victim, to say they love dogs, they majored in theater, they had a sister and a brother. And I was wondering, why am I still seeing Black people die over and over again like this? And I especially saw this in the video of Ahmaud Arbery when he was running for his life, being hunted almost in his community. And I thought, this is not Black witnessing that's happening in this video. This is lynching photography, redux. These are two men, three men actually, who were very proud of what they were doing and they were filming it. And that's when I wrote this essay and said, we need to stop sharing these videos now that we know what's going on and get to telling different stories. I spoke up on MSNBC several times, and many of their producers asked, well, what do I put in a 2-shot with you, next to you, if nothing is going on? And I said, if nothing is actually going on, then that is what you show. You show how protests can be boring sometimes. They can be kind of corny with people just doing the Cupid shuffle or something like that. Or they could just be standing and blocking a freeway. I also help correct narratives. As a daughter of DC, of the DMV, many different people were pulling this footage over here in California and saying, this is footage live from DC. And I said, there's no street that wide in DC, let me tell you. And I was looking at the different mile markers and I said, that's Frederick, Maryland, fix it. And so me speaking up around the world really this summer meant to me to not use this book as a way to just talk about police brutality, but to talk about the ways that the media have bore false witness so many times, and to urge us to do better, because it's not enough to just complain, but we must also bring to the people who are doing these things that are wrong a solution. And I said in the Atlantic, one of the things that we can do is tell better stories about the systemic racism that led us to that brutality. Instead of talking about Jacob Blake and talking about how many times he was shot in the back and showing that video over and over again. Being a true witness involves sharing how racist that area that he lives in is, how 1 in 12 African-American men are incarcerated there, how it's consistently voted the #1 and #2 worst place to live for African Americans. Let's talk about why that is. And it goes back to what James Baldwin was asking me to do. And I finally realized what he meant when he said, Black people need witnesses in this hostile world. What he was talking about was, we have to bear witness on a moral level. There's a moral imperative to speak out when we see racism at play. There's also a legal imperative. A lot of these videos are now being used in courtrooms to try to get some kind of justice for the families. And lastly, there's an imperative here journalistically. Witnessing, we always talk about eyewitness news or eyewitness this or that. Journalism has been one of the major culprits in bearing false witness throughout history. And I'm hoping through my work and me training students, this next generation of storytellers, that they tell more complete stories, that they not lean so much on official sources all of the time, and learn to trust the people who are embedded in these communities every day, the citizen journalists, and that they learn to do all of this in mind for these littlest witnesses. I'm gonna skip here. This is Dayana Reynolds, and she's the littlest witness of all of this. She was 4 years old when Philando Castile, her stepdaddy, was shot in the car she was riding in. And when I saw the footage of her in the back seat with her mom saying, Mom, please calm down, as they handcuffed her mom. And she says, I don't want you to get shot too. Please calm down. I thought this has to be the end of this generation of mass incarceration, of bad policing. It has to end with her generation. And although we are all so inspired by what Gianna said, Daddy changed the world when she was talking about George Floyd, I just can't stop thinking about these littlest witnesses in the world that they're seeing, what's normative to them. And so I dedicated the book to her, to Dayana Reynolds, because she was the same age as my daughter when Philando was taken from all of us. And so I do this work with her in mind every day. And I do this work with the hope that one day journalism will tell more well-rounded stories about Blackness, about Black people, and about Black movements. And that one day we won't have to ever wonder what exactly happened there, because we'll not only have the testimony from the person who put themselves in harm's way, but from the journalist who trusted them enough to know that something else was afoot. So I thank you for entrusting me to deliver that message as your lecturer this evening, and I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Richardson. We are, this was wonderful. We've learned a great deal, and I want to invite you who are listening to join in the conversation. Use the question and answer tab or raise your hand, and we will try to see you as much as and identify you as we begin. But I'm going to start with my question since I'm the host, and I want to begin with sort of a connective tissue question, and that is, what can clergy do to participate in this accountability? I mean, you're a journalism professor, and you're able to tell MSNBC, yeah, y'all wrong, fix this, right? But a lot of us don't have that access. So what can clergy from our sort of positions, from pulpits, from op-eds, et cetera, what can we do to participate in that culture of accountability amongst journalists?
I think that's a fantastic question. And I think one of the things that was most rewarding to me when I researched this lecture was how much Black clergy have been involved in Black liberation for such a very long time. From the outset of the AME Church's founding, you have Richard Allen working very closely and handpicking all of the editors who would then go on to form Freedom's Journal. And then as we go through in other denominations, even in the Baptist denomination, you have women who are working for that Baptist convention publishing pamphlets that are coming out of their parlors. So Mary Church Terrell and other club women are telling folks, this is how you get active, this is how you participate. And so today, I think the clergy have a very similar responsibility in that they can urge people from their privileged positions to make sure that they're speaking up in ways that they have within their power. I think over the years, we've seen an erosion almost of that relationship between the Black press and the Black church that I'd like to see come back. I'd like to see them communicate very closely with each other so that they can continue to work together. You saw some evidence of that out in Ferguson, where one of the people who rose to the top was Reverend Starsky Wilson. And he's a classmate of mine at Xavier University. And one of the things that Starsky did was band with the citizen journalists and really make sure that all Black lives were involved in that movement there. There's a passage in Patrice Cullors' memoir where she talks about it. Her book is called When They Call You a Terrorist. And she talks about how she didn't think she would be welcome as a queer woman, a queer Black woman, into that space. But Reverend Wilson said, all of you come. Anyone who is interested in making sure that we get justice for this family, everyone come to the church and organize. And so he was able to open up his Deaconess Foundation and open up the church in a way that many people thought were controversial at the time, because a lot of people in the past who were queer could not participate outwardly. For instance, we know that Bayard Rustin, for example, is one of the architects of the civil rights movement and the organizer for the March on Washington, but was sidelined often because we didn't want to confuse that message, right? Are we fighting for civil rights, or are we fighting for gay rights at this moment? What is it that we're doing? Let's focus on civil rights. And now we know, history knows that to be wrong, that it could have been a concurrent battle. But because Bayard Rustin wasn't allowed to speak at the March on Washington, much less be visible during a lot of things, we're still learning so much about just how much he did with the clergy. So to answer your original question, yes, I encourage all clergy to speak out when they feel comfortable. or even when you feel uncomfortable, writing an op-ed, getting your voice out there, making sure you're participating in your local press, inviting people who may not normally have been welcome into your spaces to convene, connect, and strategize is the best thing that I've seen happen work in the field right now.
Thank you for that. Thank you for pushing us in our call. I'm going to again invite folks. If you've got a question, you can raise your hand or uh, put your question in the chat. I think I said this before you came, participated in reading the text together. A group of staff that worked together, and we read the book and talked about it. So one of them has a question. In fact, I'll lift up that question now, and that is, if body cams don't work to hold police accountable, what can communities do to hold police accountable?
Yes, that's
and this is coming from someone who read the book.
That's a fantastic question, because I closed the book out with this conundrum, right? A lot of the families who had victims or parents or loved ones who are no longer here because of police violence thought that body cams would be the answer. And so a lot of cities then put that into place, that everyone must wear one. But then we quickly found that people were saying, well, because it's so jittery, we don't really know what happened. And so some jurors then don't trust the body cams. There's an even more disturbing hack that's come out now, that police are now playing music over top of their body cam so that YouTube and other sites will pick up on that copywritten music and they won't post the video at all. And so there's all kinds of things that are complicated when we start adding body cams. And to answer your question about what communities can do, I've seen communities actually go to much higher up legislature. So in areas of Texas, for example, where police were attempting to do this music trick, they were able to take it to their state senators and others, who then came back to the sheriff, who was an elected official, to put pressure on them. And so a lot of times people don't know that their sheriff is elected. And so part of that education is what I do too, as part of my work, is letting people know who is everyone on the ballot who stands to lose their job if they're not held accountable. The thing that we can do at a broader scale too, at the federal level, is to make sure that now that we've elected most of us the folks that we wanted, some that we didn't want maybe, even though they're there, it is our job to still focus on pushing them to make sure that they're making at a federal level an open record of everyone who has some kind of misconduct file. If I have a hit and run, for example, that's a national record that follows me. I can't just leave California and come back to Maryland and drive around. Yet for police, it is closed. So if something happens here in California, it's closed even for the next precinct over. And so what many activists are trying to call for now is to open up those misconduct records and make it difficult for police to hop from different places. And so those are just a couple of things that you can call and write your congresspersons about right now.
Thanks. We've got a question. I'm going to unmute Kasanga.
Yes, Dr. Richardson, thank you so much for your book and your presentation today. I had a chance to read it with my colleagues. One of the things, and they'll know, I struggle with is how do we witness and show videos of the violent things that happen to Black and brown bodies, but also be sensitive to not looping them all the time. I don't want people to be able to just act like it didn't happen. And turn away. And so therefore it's not real enough, but then also we want to be respectful of those who have been victims.
Absolutely. I think one of the best things that I've been telling people to do is for journalists specifically to limit the length of time that they use to show this illustrative video, or blur the face of the person just as you would if they were not Black. And when I'm sharing this with family members or colleagues, I make sure I ask if it's okay for them to see it, because some people, especially people of color, don't want to see them anymore because they see in the face of the victim a family member, somebody who looks like them. And so it re-traumatizes them in ways. So my new rule is that I always ask people that I'm sharing this with, that I'm working very closely with, if they need to see the footage, if they have. If they don't, then I still describe what actually happened. So I might say, for example, in this bearing false witness lens, that Michael Slager, for example, bore false witness against Walter Scott. He said that he ran away from him and started turning back towards him with a gun and a taser and tried to use it against him. Now, I've told you what happened without showing you Faden Santana's clip, right? Faden Santana was the man who recorded that. And so when I lecture, sometimes I'm very careful about how much I show, but just enough to let people know that these things have been going on for quite a bit of time. So your instincts are correct to make sure that you're curtailing how often that you show these things. And the last thing that I would say is if it's someone local, because a number of us have these kinds of things that are happening in our community, I would always check with the family first. And so you'll see in Ava DuVernay's film 13th, which I think is a marvelous example of this, she has put a little small caption at the bottom that said, "This video used with permission, used with Laquan McDonald's parents' permission." And so that simple act of asking the dead's family, can I use this to bear witness? Is it okay with you? Is essential. So if you're doing a broader presentation and you want to show a loved one in that way, I think it's essential to ask that permission.
Thank you. We've got two questions. I'm going to start with Dr. Rosen's question, who's a member of our faculty. What might you suggest as strategies to Indigenous young people, especially in rural areas with limited internet and smartphone availability, but some related issues of police violence? How might they bear witness to what they're going through?
I love that question. And that's Aaron Rosen, you said?
Yes, Dr. Rosen, yes.
Thank you, Dr. Rosen, for that question. I love that because a lot of what the parallels that I'm seeing now, our Indigenous communities are rising up the same way. They are using as a blueprint Black witnessing and doing their own version of that, whether they only have one phone amongst them. We saw it at Standing Rock and the No Dakota Access Pipeline uprisings that a lot of Indigenous communities are aware now that we at least need to have a phone here. Because quiet as it's kept, the statistics are even more startling and disturbing in terms of death at the hands of police when it comes to our Indigenous communities. And so they are even more likely to die than African Americans when they encounter police. And so it is a prevalent problem. And I think it's one that many of the nations are aware of now. And so it's why you saw during election season, so many Indigenous communities filming themselves with their cell phones going to the polls. And they may have only had 2 or 3 cell phones among them, but they were on horseback and they were filming themselves going to the polls. And I saw that, and I remember being in conversation with a number of women who posted that to Twitter. And I said, "You all are doing such amazing work, and I'm glad you're documenting it." And they're like, "Yes, we must." And so I think that they are slowly acquiring some of the things that they will need. But I'm still very concerned about some of these communities because, as you state, they're in rural places where you may not get a signal. And so even though you may have it filmed, how do you get it out there? And so that's the next frontier for a lot of us, is to figure out as academics and social scientists, how do we increase broadband access and Wi-Fi access during this time, especially so that people can shine a light on these things. One of the inadvertent things about this pandemic is people being conscious of where these zones are of drop signals so that kids can stay connected to their education. And it may inadvertently provide a better patchwork for them to participate in this way.
Great. We have three questions. One is from Scott here. He describes himself, "I'm a 50-year-old white male and I have seen my daughters, 18, 15, and 11, and their generation be more interested in equality for minorities and LGBTQI persons than people of my own generation. I would like to know, how can someone like me, Scott, help to make sure our generation stays involved? It seems like the other generations are getting ahead, but the question is about sort of generational involvement. Are there particular strategies?" I'm going to dovetail that question a bit, Scott, and say, is that also a technological piece that may be involved in that? How is technology a way for that involvement to happen?
I think so. I think one of the things that's been most rewarding about doing this Mojo work is that I get to teach all different generations, and they teach each other. And so whereas the baby boomers, as we call them, may be still trying to figure out, some small feature of Snapchat or maybe Instagram, a technological issue, they have the background and the context that's needed, though, for the youth to do this job well. And so many of my young people, when I lecture on things like this, say, I've never heard of Emmett Till, or I never knew why people out there marching had an I am a man placard. Why are they saying I am a man? Of course, it's visible you are. And I said, well, that harkens back to Dr. King and his work. And they don't know that his last stand, that mountaintop speech he gave, was for sanitation workers in Memphis. And they were like, oh, we just knew that he was assassinated at the Lorraine Motel, but we didn't even know why he was there. And so I get startled when I hear things like this because they were ingrained in me as a young person. But I realize that boomers and millennials have a lot of work to do with Gen Z, not because they don't care, but because they have so much information and they need help parsing it. They need the context and the background to do good work, no matter what field they're in. And so when you talk about generational difference, I think being open to learning from your young person, all the new tech apps and stuff is important, but also make it an exchange and pass down. Do you know why this is happening? Or do you know the last time this happened? Or do you know how this parallels 1968? And really go into detail with them so that they can remember those things. And I promise you they will, because I remember when I was 9 and my dad explained to me Rodney King and what was going on in LA. And here I am living in LA, a stone's throw from where it all happened. So if that's not God ordering those steps, I don't know what is. Because the fact that a Maryland girl will end up here in the heart of where Mojo began, I believe is no accident.
Wow. So the next one is more personal. And that is, I'm just going to read it. Hello, Dr. Richardson. Please bear with me, my old school limitations, which force me to ask. If I witness a crime and record it on my cell phone, what is my next step? How do I pass it on? And who would be the most effective outlet to pass it on to? P.S. I love you, by the way. And that's from Russell Wright.
Hi, Mr. Wright. That's such a great question, Mr. Wright. I think that the best thing that you can do is download the ACLU's app. The ACLU has an app that will pinpoint your exact location. And as soon as you finish hitting record, as soon as you release your finger from it, it will send it to a chapter of the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, near you. And then it will also alert 5 of your closest contacts, and it will send them a text that says, I'm in trouble. What a lot of people have done after that is then posted to social media. So Darnella Frazier, for example, 17 years old, had the wherewithal to film George Floyd being killed, then posted it to YouTube. Diamond Reynolds did the same thing. She was the first person to use Facebook Live to live stream one of these killings, her beloved Philando Castile. And so one of the first things I tell people is do an immediate send using that ACLU app, and then try to trickle it to some of the platforms where you know you have eyeballs. The last thing I would do too is even if you're not in a police brutality situation, is make sure your phone is programmed on its emergency settings. On the side of most iPhones, I don't know about Samsung, sorry, but on iPhones, you push the button 5 times rapidly and it will automatically dial 911 and alert your loved ones that you're in trouble. And so even if it's a non-police related emergency, everyone should have that setting already programmed. As a journalist, I do, so that people will know where I am and what's going on.
Thank you. That question is personal to both Dr. Richardson and I, because that's our high school band director.
Yes.
So very instrumental in not just teaching the both of us about music, but also taught the both of us about raising our consciousness about our own Black identity. So glad to have you, Mr. Wright, on this. Another question here. What do you see the role of the creative artist in our Black community, artists, poets, writers, musicians, in interpreting or reinterpreting these images? So is there a way, much like the image from the New Yorker, is there a way that these images, what role do they play, the creative artists, to do this work?
I love that question because at my very core, as Dr. Lee's been saying, I'm a band person, right? I play the trumpet, and trumpets bring the good news. We're announcers. We announce things. In the Bible, we announce, trumpets are blowing because walls are falling down, right? And so instruments and art have always tried to share news. They're not just existing because they look pretty, or in many cases because someone felt like it. They're trying to say something. And so when I think of even in Mr. Wright's class, one of the things that I really loved, my favorite set we used to do was a Marvin Gaye medley, What's Going On? And I'll never forget that we went to Landover Mall when it existed, and Nathan McCall, who was a Washington Post journalist, was signing books. And the title of his book was What's Going On, right? And he talked to us at length. We got a chance to discuss, and then we went down into the big amphitheater and played a Marvin Gaye medley. And Marvin Gaye is still one of my favorite artists because he was trying to tell us back then about police brutality and trying to tell us then about how it was going to be such a big issue going forward. And when I think of all the major riots, as the news has called them over the years, each one has begun because of police brutality. And so artists have to make art even when they feel like they're in turmoil, even when they're in pain, because they're communicating an archive and they're creating an archive, a soulful one that lets people know what was going on, to paraphrase Marvin Gaye.
Thank you. Good questions. We have about 6 minutes left. Other thoughts or ideas from our audience, from our folks? Let me make a quick comment while we wait. I am struck in your presentation about the amount of spiritual language of the folks you've interviewed, the folks who have been sojourning, describing how, they talked about, this felt spiritual, or this moment was, even though they may or may not be spiritual themselves, in terms of they may not have a overt spirituality. So this idea of morality, witnessing and morality going hand in hand, is a very interesting dynamic. And I'm wondering, I don't know what to make of that. I guess I'm commenting on that in some sort of way. Is that something that you found across all 15 of your subjects?
Absolutely. And I asked them explicitly about it. What was their faith and how did it play a role in what they were doing? And their answers really varied. You have PKs, so to speak, preachers' kids like Brittany Packnett, who grew up in the James Cone tradition of Black liberation politics and theology. And she was just saying, my father was a pastor, and he told me if I see something wrong, that I have a moral obligation to speak out on it and do it. And that's what she does in her work every single day now as what we would call a professional journalist. The same thing with Devin Allen, who I showed at the very top of the presentation. He said, I may not go to church every single week, every single Sunday, but I feel God when I walk these streets. He said, I know he protects me. He said, because I could have had so many run-ins with cops. In fact, the week before he recorded or shot those pictures of the Freddie Gray uprisings, he had 3 friends pass away in a car that he could have been in. And he said, but God spared me so I could take these photographs and bear witness. And he said it in those words. And there's points in times where I'm interviewing folks and crying alongside them like, oh my goodness, this is amazing that you felt this call. And so it's not any different from what I've read of our ancestors, where Ida B. Wells is talking about shining the light of justice upon things to show truth. And then there's so many different references to light in the Bible, where Jesus is talking about how he is the light, or how his words are supposed to be a light. And so there's so many different references there that I think people have because they're raised by these grannies who have ingrained it in them. And even though they've if they've walked away, they come right back to it when they needed to. Right.
So Reverend Ray Doris Stewart, who is a member of our staff and works in our writing center, I think you've got a question. Go ahead. You'll need to unmute.
Am I good now?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Richardson, for such a vibrant story and use of story to talk about Mojo and your work. Thank you for doing the heavy lifting there. My question is about using the tool of the hashtag, and does the hashtag imprint on what we post make its way to the newsrooms, or is that really just a grassroots way that we are able to research and see who else is talking about what we're doing? I, in my Writing for Ministry course at Wesley, I teach my students to use social media as part of their publication finals. And I really stress how to use, how to tag, people, agencies, and organizations, but also to craft a well-crafted hashtag. I am viewing it as the discipline of creating a headline and the impact that headlines do. And so I want to know, am I on the right path to stress the efficacy of using and crafting well-tuned hashtags?
Thank you, Reverend Stewart, for that question. And I'm so excited to hear that you're urging your students to use hashtags to communicate, because as you suggested, they do work both ways. They're one, an organizing feature for outsiders who are just learning about a phenomenon so that they can see what is the cause, what is the call to action. But they're also an organizing feature on the other side in terms of people wanting to see, is this thing actually sticking? Is it going viral? And I think it's worth noting that African Americans pioneered that as well. 3 of the most phenomenal hashtags that became movements were started by Black women in this last decade. Black Lives Matter began as a hashtag. Oscar So White became a hashtag. Me Too was a hashtag. And so all of these things that have become so pervasive and really rocked major industries that we didn't think could even sway, much less topple, were started by Black folks. And so I think it's just appropriate to show that stroke of genius, to use the hashtag in that way to create these new school I am a man placards, if you will, has been incredibly effective. So yes, keep teaching your students that it's essential to use them to organize their thoughts and movements.
We've got 3 questions in the hopper, and it's 6 o'clock here on the East Coast. Is it all right that we continue with you?
Sure, yes, I'd like to answer those questions. I don't want to be left out.
Okay, great, thank you. So one is from a student. It says, what are some ways in which we can encourage those who may feel timid to utilize their voices? What are some ways in which, particularly, I'm gonna dovetail that as well, particularly, how did you encourage young girls in South Africa and Morocco to use their voices in their way, in cultures that otherwise wouldn't honor them?
Absolutely. I love that question because there's something magical that happened when they held the camera. So when they were holding it and directing it towards themselves, you know how you feel when you take a selfie. Most students take 185 selfies before they post the right one.
Right.
And so for my students, for them, it became a way of testing out, how do I look? How do I sound on camera? Let me play that back so I can perfect my approach. And now I'm less shy because I know what I look like. I don't have the self-consciousness of a camera person standing there with a bulkier machine asking me to hurry up and run through something. I can get good at this on my own. And so I think for shyer folks, my introverted students really blossomed because they got to hear, oh, that's what I sound like? I probably should come out of my shell a little bit more. And it was really rewarding to see around week 2, out of 4 weeks there, around week 2 is when you get the introverts to warm up and say, this is my camera, this is my body, this is my voice.
Mm-hmm.
And even our mantra that we told them, this is my world, this is my story. I am blank, reporting from South Africa. And so that empowered them because they were like, my world, my story. And sometimes they'd be chanting that when we were on the bus on the way back, and I have a headache because they're just like all excited and amped about something that we did, some story. And they're like, my world, my story, my world. And so it's so cute when I, think about that work that we did, because they were opening up their eyes to, I don't have to just be the person that someone casually parachutes in to ask questions to and then leaves, and I have no control over that. I can control my narrative. So when working with shy students, give them as many chances as they can to practice alone, and then ease them into practicing with just you, and then do the whole class exercise if you can.
That's great. So we got a 2-parter here. It comes from one of the staff at Wesley who participated in the reading of the book. In your book, you talk about how the activists cycle through the 6 steps of news production, just like professional journalists. Do you happen to know whether or not they, individually or as a group, had any formal journalism training? And second part of that, do you happen to know whether or not they, the group or the individual had, oh, it's the same question. Yeah, did they have any formal journalism training?
No, and that's the exciting part is I sought people who did not have any formal training at all. And they led me to other people who were just out there figuring it out. And I think what was so astonishing to me and alarming to my students who were paying to be trained is that so much of this was learned from what they saw not to do. And so they saw a lot of journalists who were making these huge gaffes and they knew they didn't want to make them too. And so they were doing a different brand of journalism. And I think the training then came because Black Twitter has a way of checking itself. So if they got something wrong, they would be checked immediately. And the community would then say, sis, that's not it. That's not what happened. Don't tell people that. And that immediate retraction that would then come because they're like, I do not want to get dragged further, to speak in internet parlance, is really what would correct them. And so that happens so much quicker than it would in a newsroom because we kind of have this arrogance about us about telling a story. And it's not until it builds to the level of viral scandal that we eventually say, okay, sorry, if we ever say sorry. And so that wasn't the case. And what I found with the citizen journalists, the community was so close knit and so tightly, so committed to telling the truth in a different way that they checked each other.
Thank you. We have been talking with Dr. Allissa Richardson, author and scholar of journalism and Mojo. I like that. My children will love that you're a Mojo scholar. And we thank you for all of you who have participated either in reading the book or and engaging in this lecture and having some kind of dialogue. There is a request that how do we get signed copies of your text? I don't know how that is. Maybe you and I can follow up offline about figuring out.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we can figure out how to make that work. But we thank you so much. For us, Wesley is a seminary that commits itself to a witness in the public square. And so part of what your presentation allows for us to do is to ruminate on all of the ways that we as clergy have to participate in the sphere of the so-called, fourth estate, fifth estate, and how we might be able to sojourn and hold accountable. So thank you for all that you've given us and the ways in which you've helped us to learn as a result. Any last words or thoughts from you?
Yes, I'd just like to add that the clergy have always been essential in telling the truth about what's going on in the world. And in one of the most poignant memories I can think about recently was when I looked at Mother Emanuel Church, a Methodist church in South Carolina that was attacked so viciously. And I think about the people who were involved in Bible study at that time and what they were doing when they were attacked. But I also think that that is the same building that Denmark Vesey founded. That same church was the one that he founded alongside a lesser known character, Martin Delaney, who was a journalist who worked very closely with Frederick Douglass. And so to think that that same place of sanctuary that they sought when they were trying to organize the biggest slave revolt that never happened, and how it was still unsafe, still dangerous to gather there, but they did it anyway that day in South Carolina. Just really draws to me just these historic underpinnings of how the Black clergy and the Black press have always worked hand in hand for change, and how the church has always been an organizing space of sanctuary and succor for us. And so I encourage all of us to bring our faith into everything that we do and infuse it as much as we can. And I just like to thank you all for giving me the space to talk about how the two intertwine, because I said at the top, it's not often that I get to do that. So thank you for your time.
Thank you. And when this pandemic is over and the next time you come back to the East Coast, come back home, we'll make sure to up at Wesley so we can see you in person.
Absolutely.
All right. Thank you all so much for participating in our 2020 Martin Luther King lecture. We are excited to have you all. This has been recorded. We have not decided how we're going to distribute it to the Wesley community, but we'll find some way to make sure that it's available to you all. So God bless you. Stay safe and wear a mask. Good night.